Final Fantasy VII, one of the most recognisable and infamous names in the gaming history. A game so famous and loved by everyone that even the older people you work with somehow recognise it. Now, has that got anything to do with the fact it is a 25-year-old game? Well, yes, one could argue so, but regardless, even now in 2022, it is easily one of the most highly regarded gaming experiences made to date. It's managed to win over the hearts of millions across the world, really making people even outside of the JRPG circle realise, hey, these games are pretty sick. What Final Fantasy VII has managed to accomplish can never be overlooked, and in all fairness, it actually isn't. It's still regarded as one of the greatest JRPGs you could ever play, despite its age and heavily outdated looks, many claiming the story and characters being the greatest ever, and of course, the materia system will forever get praised no matter how many years it's been. But that doesn't change one fact. Whether you agree with this or not, this game's looks are outdated by today's standards. Now that statement right there isn't supposed to change any opinions you might have. It's not about the story, characters, script, combat, music, any of that. It's purely based on the presentation that Final Fantasy VII comes with. What I'm mostly referring to here is your average everyday gamer who will take just 1 minute to look at this game and not even bother experiencing all the highs and lows it has simply because it's too old. So when looking at it that way, alongside the humongous fanbase of the game, Square Enix decided to make the same choice many other developers have in recent years. It was time to remake Final Fantasy VII. And if my time management didn't let me down, then this video should be coming out around the 2-year anniversary of this release. Now this could have gone so many ways, but no matter what they decided to do, one thing was certain: this game would sell because the fans wanted it. Final Fantasy VII has been one of the most requested games, overdue for a graphical upgrade. It was becoming harder to get any sort of new fans into the Final Fantasy VII universe the more time has passed. So all Square Enix had to do was smoothen out the textures, shorten the load times, maybe add some voice acting here or there if they really wanted to, and just your typical small upgrade stuff that we've seen in other Final Fantasy games such as 8, 9, 10, 12, all getting this treatment. However, Square Enix decided to take a different approach. They didn't go for a simple graphical upgrade or just new 3D models like we've seen with many of the older titles like Final Fantasy IV for example. They instead decided to truly remake the entire FF7, or at least the first 10 to 15%, but we'll talk more about that later. Bringing to life one of gaming's most iconic cities, Midgar. And yet with all the enormous amounts of excitement towards the remake, that would also bring a sad and scary possibility, that being disappointment. The more loved a game or franchise, the higher and more likely is the possibility of letting down the fans. The bigger you are, the harder you fall, and in the case of Final Fantasy VII, as far as a Square Enix game or even just JRPGs in general, this is pretty much as big as you can be. So in this video, I'll be going into detail discussing the Final Fantasy VII Remake, everything it offers from beginning to end as a standalone game, but also the possibilities moving forward, and how on April 10th, 2020, we learned this game truly was Square Enix attempting the impossible. It's necessary I point out there will be spoilers after a certain point of this video for both the remake and the original FF7, so if you wanted to stay away from the original FF7 spoilers, then I recommend not to watch past this point right here. Okay, there should be a timer on the screen if I actually remember to edit this. I will give my opinions and theories regarding some of the final moments during the remake. However, if you're looking for a 1-hour discussion regarding a single character, then this video isn't for you. There are many other videos out there which do a much better job of that than I ever could. Do keep in mind everything said throughout this video is purely my opinion, which in no way whatsoever is more valuable or correct than whatever your opinion might be. I do encourage you to leave a comment below stating some of your opinions regarding both the game and the video, as not only does it start conversations, but it also heavily helps this video and channel to perform better in the analytics. Which brings me to my last request, and that is, if you did enjoy the video, do drop a like, as these take a lot of time to make, and your likes and comments help it perform better on YouTube, potentially drawing in a lot of new viewers to the channel. The aim is to hit 15,000 subs by the end of the year, so if you are new here, then definitely consider subbing for future videos like this one. But that's more than enough blabbing for now. Without any further ado, let's get into the video discussing the Final Fantasy VII Remake, everything it offers, the potential of it moving forward, and the many questions it left us with. The game begins by throwing you right into the action through the eyes and experience of Cloud Strife, an ex-soldier who is now assisting an eco-terrorist group called Avalanche. Your mission objective is to assist in blowing up a Mako reactor, with Mako being the main source of energy used by Shinra within Midgar. As confusing as these names might be to start with, the best and most simple way to remember all of this is, Mako is a form of the planet's lifestream used as the main source of energy within the world of Final Fantasy VII. Shinra is an industrial enterprise using Mako in pretty much every way possible, from supplying energy to homes, all the way to creating weapons and super military units referred to as soldiers. And just to be clear, yes, it has to be spelled in capital letters, otherwise it does not count. Lastly, Midgar is the city in which Shinra headquarters are located, but it is also the location for the entirety of this remake. Again, after the first couple minutes, all of this will feel pretty basic, unlike some previous Final Fantasy entries that took half the game to explain its basic lore. I still love you, Final Fantasy 13. This section of Cloud working as a merc to help in the reactor detonation makes up the entirety of Chapter 1, which has two main objectives. First is the introduction of the main characters as well as the supporting crew members. Within this 1 hour or so chapter, you will meet Cloud, Barrett, Wedge, Biggs, and the one and only best girl, Jessie. The second objective is the introduction of the new, no longer turn-based combat system through not just Cloud but Barrett as well. The rest of the group are major side characters who impact the story, however at no point are they playable or even fight alongside you. For the time being, I will only focus on the characters and story side of things to keep things as structured as possible throughout this video, but don't worry, there will be a lot to talk about regarding the gameplay later on. Chapter 1 does not waste any time. Every bit of the chapter serves a purpose, whether that's explaining a new section of combat, exploring the characters and the personalities, breaking down the idea of how these reactors work, or having the player understand why Avalanche is out to destroy them. It quickly makes it clear Shinra is killing the planet with their methods of doing things, and we are here to stop it. It's basically saying no biggie, just out here trying to save the planet. What it also makes very clear is that Cloud used to work for Shinra, which creates a clearly uncomfortable and at times awkward relationship between him and Barrett, who is not only the leader of Avalanche but is also by far the most passionate member when it comes to taking down Shinra. Funnily enough, within this chapter, these two are possibly the easiest characters to dislike. One is an over-the-top, in-your-face muscle man who seems to overreact to anything you say, even a tiny bit different from his ideology, whilst the other can come off a little bit too cool for you and all your problems you might have. You know, I'm just here to get my money and I'm out. Actually, that's exactly what Cloud is like in the first chapter. But that's the key to point out. These are just the first impressions we get in Chapter 1. They are far from the fully developed characters we see by the end of the journey. Chapter 1 ends with our first of many boss fights, giving us an idea of just how grand these can be throughout the game. And honestly, if anything, this game knows exactly how to make a boss fight look pretty. The reactor blows up just as we aimed for, however the size of the explosion is far greater than anticipated due to Shinra getting involved without the crew realizing. This is a very subtle but smart way of the game showing us the truth early on regarding who is the good and bad guys. Sure, we as the player could just believe Barrett and everything he says, however in that small sample size we get during Chapter 1, it is made clear he's not someone who can be talked out of his beliefs. What's to say that maybe, just maybe, he's overreacting and maybe these things aren't as bad as they seem? Well, by the end of Chapter 1, everything is clear. Barrett is 100% correct and Shinra are the villains of the story. Or at least they are for now. The beginning stage of Chapter 2 has everyone escaping through a damaged and heavily ruined Sector 8 caused by the explosion from Reactor 1, which at this point in time we still believe to be fully our fault. As you head through the streets trying to reach the train station, the game makes you take in the damage caused not just by the environment around you but also its people. Citizens of all ages crying from fear, trying to put together just what might be happening around them as the buildings and roads collapse one after another. The game really does an incredible job of having you realize the scale of this explosion. It brings about the thought of, is this really okay? Just moments earlier before separating, Barrett gives this big speech to the group, but is this doing more damage than good to the people? Of course, we know Avalanche wants what's best for the planet and its people, however, how much is too much when it comes to sacrifices on the way? What gives us the right to include these civilians, these innocent children and adults, in what we believe to be the right thing? There is a lot more that can be said about Chapter 2, especially the middle point of it, but I want to save all of that for my spoiler talk nearer the end of the video. So for now, we will skip over to Chapter 3 just for one more character introduction because it's a big one. Tifa Lockhart, a childhood friend of Cloud's, now member of Avalanche and soon to be the third main party member, is finally introduced. A young, beautiful, shy, yet extremely tough at times character. Despite her appearance and fierce fighting style, she is a gentle girl, one that's heavily affected by everything taking place, and unlike many others, she finds it hard to just get on with some of the plans Avalanche has set out. This is made clear through her reactions and self-doubt, as well as even other characters questioning if she's really cut out for this. Chapter 3 is designed for two main reasons, the first one being Tifa, and the second is the introduction of side quests and side activities. Tifa takes Cloud around Sector 7 slums, helping out civilians with extra cash, and even though many might not like the idea of these side quests, which we will discuss in much more detail later on, the fact that Tifa is the one taking you around to do this fits perfectly with her personality as well as the story. She can easily be seen as the motherly type, the one who wants nothing but the best for everyone around her and wishes everyone could just be on the same page. And this is extra clear when she introduces Cloud to different people around the slums, thinking of ways to resolve their problems even if it requires a bit of convincing for Cloud. It's also at this point that we start actually seeing a bit more of Cloud's other side in terms of personality. Due to them having a history together already, Tifa is the first character we see that really manages to get a proper engagement out of it. It might not be constant or obvious, but there are glimpses of a hidden, less moody and less uptight ex-soldier deep down. But now that we've been introduced to 3 of our main party members, I would say it's about time we cover the gameplay, as these 3 are easily who you spend the most time playing with. This segment will be split into 2 sections, starting off by talking about the presentation and exploration factors, later on followed by the combat. There will be footage from across the game to showcase different stages of combat and exploration, however, no final bosses or clear gameplay sections which could spoil anyone's late game experience. The Final Fantasy VII Remake did not hold back in any aspect when it comes to shaking up its visuals and gameplay. It decided to go with a modern, slightly closer behind the character camera angle rather than a more typical, further away view we've seen in other Square Enix titles, such as even Kingdom Hearts. This helps in making Midgar feel immersive and realistic. You yourself are exploring the streets of the Mako City. As mentioned earlier during chapter 2 when you're walking through the streets after the explosion, this camera angle allows for a human perspective of the size and damage being dealt. You can literally compare your size to that of the bridge falling down. Even during the most simple moments such as walking through the streets of the slums, it will have multiple moments where you will just stop and appreciate the things you're looking at. This is partially why I would consider the remake to be one of the best options when it comes to introducing someone to Final Fantasy for the first time. I understand many might disagree with that idea as it is far from what originally made Final Fantasy great. However, you are still getting a mostly old school Final Fantasy story but showcased in the most modern way possible, which for many would be more inviting than the idea of an outdated cutscene or waiting for your turn to attack. And that's coming from someone who loves the older entries, but I just don't think I could ever recommend FF7 as someone's first Final Fantasy. If you really wanted to make it turn-based, I would say Final Fantasy 9 and 10 are by far better choices, simply because of the graphical jumps they had. Now for someone who has history or any sort of detailed relation with the original game, it's moments like these that most likely make you think, it's just like I always imagined. Bringing to life older fantasies of the past, with living citizens walking around having discussions and reacting to recent events. You don't have to walk up to someone to see what they have to say. These people are living their everyday lives, talking with friends, their kids and others just naturally rather than you having to force it out of them. As you start making a name for yourself within each section, you'll even hear people discussing recent rumours about you, from how you're the new merc in town to even Avalanche's most recent activities, both the good and the bad of course. I have to respect the fact this game is well aware of just how stunning it is, constantly doing zoom-ins to showcase something happening in the back, or forcefully slowing down your movements, making you look around just so none of this goes unappreciated. It's clear the developers wanted this game to be taken slowly. There is obvious amounts of love and care, and they are only working with about 15% of the original game, resulting in them wanting you to be immersed far longer than you ever were in the original. All that said, whilst I do respect it for being so proud of its visual beauty and wanting to showcase it, that's not to say it does it perfectly, because it doesn't take long to realise some of these slower scenarios take place far too often to come off as subtle. Whilst going through the game for this video, I couldn't help but constantly compare it to another PlayStation exclusive from 2018, which did something very similar a little bit too much for my liking, that game being God of War. As much as I think the new God of War is a real work of art and deserves every single bit of praise it got over the years, I can't overlook the fact it had many moments that slowed down what otherwise is a fast-paced and amped up gameplay. However, when comparing the two, it is clear one does it much better than the other. God of War's way of doing it is much smoother and less noticeable, which can be for 2 main reasons. These sections within God of War are much less common, only during interactions with things like big doors, opening a gate, climbing down certain ladders and so on, whereas the remake will sometimes put these in front of areas you'll need to go back to multiple times just to complete a mission. Whilst I do understand these are there to allow the following area to load in properly, the true art and difficulty comes in trying to not make it too obvious to the player. The less these are done, the less opportunity there is to realise. Which brings me to the second and arguably main reason. When comparing the average time it takes for a player to complete both games, the 7 remake is about 10 hours longer on average, and that is just the main story. It just gives the player 10 extra hours to get frustrated with sections where all they can do is patiently walk across something that is clearly within a jumping distance. And as I kept playing and more of these sections kept popping up, something became very clear. the remake often gives a false sense of freedom to explore within these big areas. Yes, you can go left, right, back and forth, but most of the time there is only one route to take to advance, and that route will be filled with sections that will slow you down tremendously. This makes the idea of a second playthrough far less exciting, knowing that certain chapters, shout out to chapter 6 and chapter 11, will just feel like a drag with constant ladder climbing, button pressing, ducking underneath rubble, and so on. Like I mentioned earlier, it's fine to do this once in a while, but the remake struggles from having far too many of these within the same area. It is such an easy way to just kill the flow of the game. Whilst I do understand this is due to hardware limitations and the game simply needing to load, I do believe it's something major for Square Enix to target moving forward, considering a game that came out 2 years prior managed to do a better job of this. But that said, considering part 2 will be coming to the PS5, I do fully expect and hope Square Enix actually utilizes the hardware. I think now is a good time to tackle one of the biggest parts of the game, that of course being the combat. You don't have to be a huge fan of the original to look at the remake and realize this is nothing like that. Gone are the days of turn-based combat, now replaced with Square Enix's new direction of real-time action, similar to what we had in Final Fantasy 15. That said, it is much more than that once you look further into it. 7 Remake took back a lot of the feedback after 15 to make sure this is the best version of an action combat a modern Final Fantasy has brought to the table. As unfortunate as it might be, 15 had to walk in order for the remake to run. Similar to what we've seen in previous entries such as Final Fantasy 13, every single enemy has a stagger meter separate from their HP for you to fill up. This stagger will be affected based on the enemy's weaknesses. Some may be weak to lightning whilst others to fire, the same way some may be unaffected by certain magic, so physical attacks will have to lead the way. Whilst each attack will chip away the enemy's total HP, it's once you stagger the enemy that the damage dealt is massively increased. Certain enemies will require you to stagger them if you want any chance at real damage, whilst others will die before you even get a chance to do so. The game simply offers a fair balance of both. But it's time we discuss how to actually achieve this through the remake's combat. The combat can be broken down into multiple layers. First thing to note is you can constantly switch which party member you control without limits. Every character has a basic attack which showcases their playstyle. Cloud uses his sword for slashing attacks, Tifa is a fist fighter making her a close range fast attacker, and Barret uses his gun arm to shoot enemies from a distance. Each one of these has its own benefits and drawbacks. For example, Barret is the ideal character for taking down enemies in the air or out of bounds, however his basic attack is by far the weakest of the group. This is supposed to make the player utilize each character fully in order to defeat bigger groups of enemies. Unfortunately, this doesn't always work out, which I will talk more about after fully explaining the rest of the combat. As you fight, each character will gradually build up their ATB gauge for attacks or taking damage. This attacks for multiple options outside of the standard attacks, that being magic, skills, and item usage. Each time any of these is used, it will require 1 ATB charge, with some occasional skills or summons requiring 2 charges. This prevents any sort of skill or ability spamming, as you need to build up the gauge in the first place. This is on top of the preset limitations such as how much MP is available to perform certain spells. For the most part, this makes combat in Remake not just constant hack and slash, but adds strategy during crucial points of fights. Should you keep attacking or heal just in case a big attack is coming up? If you only have 1 charge available but everyone is low HP, who should you heal? Which character has the highest chance of surviving longer? The gameplay section becomes extremely slow during these moments, adding suspense to the situation as you calculate your next move. Whilst this might not happen too often outside of boss battles, if you were to do a hard mode playthrough, each fight can feel like this, especially with your MP being much more limited in that difficulty. Outside of all of this, every character also has a unique skill that is always available to them by pressing triangle. For Barret, that is Overcharge, a heavy hitting attack that charges up his ATB gauge more than a normal one. It takes a bit more time to recharge this afterwards to prevent just spamming it for ATB gauges, but it can be sped up by pressing triangle over and over again. In the case of Tifa, it's actually 3 different skills: an uppercut, Omni Strike, and Rise and Fall. The uppercut is the default option always available to her, but if the player wishes to use any of the other 2, they have to use a separate skill that raises her attack power. The catch is this skill requires ATB charges, meaning in order to use, let's say, Rise and Fall, you will need to use up 2 ATB charges to get to that stage initially. Both of these characters have limitations on how these unique skills are handled. It makes the game far more balanced and prevents spamming or cheesing throughout fights. Unfortunately, where things aren't so balanced is with the star of the show, Cloud. There is no denying Cloud is the easiest character to use, especially in the early game. He has the best skills available as well as his unique skill, Mode Shift. Through this ability, Cloud can switch up between 2 fighting styles: Operator Mode, which has well balanced attacks, the ability to guard, and a lot of agility to his movement. The other is Punisher Mode, which is a fully attack focused fighting style. Although Cloud does become much slower in this mode, his attacks do far greater damage plus have some of the most aggressive combos in the game. This is on top of the fact instead of guarding, he counters any physical attacks done to him, making this extremely overpowered for close range combat or attacking staggered enemies. Whilst the biggest drawback should be his slow movements and inability to guard against magic attacks, if at any point the player wants to avoid damage, they can just roll out of the way, which puts him right back into operator mode. Unlike all other characters, there is no drawback to how often Cloud can switch up his fighting style, making his fights a bit too easy for what they should be at times. This is especially obvious in the early game when, whilst other characters haven't got that many overpowering moves, Cloud can defeat any sort of enemy in half the time, if not faster. As you keep defeating enemies, you will level up per the usual standard RPG method. But what matters far more in the remake are the two key components: weapons and materia. To start with the weapons first, each character will have a range of different weapons to equip. Each of these weapons come with a skill attached to it. As you keep using that skill, it will eventually be learned, meaning you can use it even with another weapon equipped. This process doesn't take too long, but it encourages the player to at least attempt every single weapon out there. But it's the leveling system of these weapons that matter the most. As you fight, you will earn AP points. These are used to level up your weapons in their own skill tree. Unlike many RPGs where the characters have their own skill trees, the 7 Remake instead uses that for weapons. Each weapon offers different upgrades such as high attack, magic attack, defense, HP, materia slots, critical hit rate, and many more. The amount and range of these upgrades available depends on the weapon and its fighting style. If it's an attack focused weapon, you might find more upgrades for attack, critical hits, and materia. Whereas if it's a magic build, you'll find more upgrades for magic attack, magic defense, or even the effectiveness of spells. But what this skill tree system means is that at no point are your character stats set. It will always depend on the weapons you have equipped. You want more MP for a boss fight coming up? Sure, you can totally do that, but your physical attack will suffer because of it. It's a fresh method to have you consider what options you really want and what playstyle suits you depending on each character. However, not everything is decided through the weapons, and that's thanks to arguably one of the most iconic systems in RPG history: the materia system. Now, before going any further, I do want to clarify, just because I called it one of the most iconic, that doesn't mean it's perfect or anywhere near as revolutionary as it was back in the 90s, but for now, let's actually explain how it works. The materia system works around items called materia. Honestly, who would have guessed? These are the orbs made out of macro energy and contain a range of different benefits, from magic spells, support and command abilities, summons, or can even boost your stats. These materials are equipped to either your weapons or accessories, with each character needing their own set equipped. The amount you can use at once depends on what weapon and accessory you have, with some having more slots available. These material level up separately from the characters or weapons. They require much more usage and time to reach the next stage. This means the method of achieving high level spells requires you to have the selected material equipped as much as possible. Some materia are able to link together for greater benefits, such as using elemental materia in combination with a fire materia will add fire damage to each regular attack that character does. Another popular combination would be using the magnify materia and cure to expand the healing range to not just the character using it, but also those around them. This can greatly save the amount of MP or ATB charge used by a character. It's little things like this that are extremely crucial, especially on a hard playthrough of the game. Even though it may feel very basic at the beginning, this system shines more and more as the game goes on, where you start acquiring more powerful materia, alongside having more materia slots available if you go that route with your weapon. And this was the exact same case back in the original FF7, where the first few hours it might not be mind-blowing, however near the end of the game the amount of combinations available was just ridiculous, with the player being able to figure out a new combo pretty much every time they tried something different. Unfortunately, as fun and beneficial as it is, the remake just isn't able to showcase the real greatness of the system. After all, it is still an early point of the entire story, so there is no extremely overpowered or game-breaking materia available. This is just one of the many limitations that comes from splitting this remake into parts. It would make no sense giving the player something so powerful in just part 1, as it would completely break the balance heading into future parts. So whilst it definitely gives a tease of what it could offer, unfortunately we won't be seeing its true greatness shine until at least the second half of part 2. Before going any further, I do want to point out from this point onwards I will be referencing the original game a bit more, as well as discussing plot points of the remake, so do keep that in mind before continuing. The one thing that can't be denied is how beautiful the remake is. I've said it before, the game feels like a full-on cinematic experience during some of its cutscenes. It is easily what I would consider the most beautiful Final Fantasy to date when it comes to showcasing its main cast. I mean, look at those eyes! I never expected to be this passionate about video game eyes. Top 10 eyes in video games coming up. It is necessary to spend a moment here looking at how this remake not only managed to bring to life some of the biggest icons in Final Fantasy history, but how it also did all of them justice. But I think it's only right we start by looking at the main one. After all, this is what you'll be looking at and interacting with for the biggest part of the game, and that of course is Midgar. It takes a lot of guts for a company to say they will remake one of its most famous games ever made, then say it will be split into parts, with part 1 only covering the first city where the game starts. Midgar is iconic and loved by the fanbase, however the idea of turning a 5 to 6 hour experience into a full-blown 30+ hour game is no easy task. And even though it has moments that clearly force this to be a longer experience than it had to be, it's undeniable that the streets and people of Midgar were done justice. The city feels alive. As you're walking through the slums, there are people talking, interacting, and living their everyday lives without you having to force a conversation. The colour of Mako surrounding the city, the idea of these plates being on top of you anytime you decide to look up, or even some new sections like an orphanage and a backyard where all the kids hang out without the adults interrupting, it allows for a stronger emotional attachment and a deeper care during some later sections of the story where the city is affected by certain actions. And even though I have mentioned before how its exploring areas don't really lead to anything special, it's incredible how accurate some of these recreated areas are to the original game. For someone playing this with no previous experience, this is just another video game city. But for lovers of the original, seeing all of this from a new perspective could even be an emotional moment. However, as we look past Midgar, it's the people within it, or more specifically, the people who are a part of our story, that come to life truly in the most mesmerizing way possible. And this goes beyond just looking good. It's about the way they interact, their facial expressions matched by top tier voice acting. So much goes into bringing a character to life, and when that character has been around for 23 years, there's even more pressure to nail it. From the main cast of Cloud, Barrett, and Tifa, to even those that weren't the focus point in the original, that being Jesse, Wedge, and Biggs. As someone who didn't play the original until I was in my mid-teens, I never related or felt as much of a strong connection with these characters as some of the OG fans. But what this remake managed to do was make me extremely invested into each and every single one of them, to the point they felt genuinely real. Anytime a character like Barrett would do something I found to be cringe or just awkward, I also knew that wasn't because of bad execution, but rather the voice acting, alongside great camera work showing other characters' reactions, was spot on in showcasing this is the real Barrett. He has these awkward or extremely loud moments where you just want to tell him to shut up. I also can't ignore the fact this game made me fall in love with Jessie's character. In the original, she wasn't really someone I remembered well, but this game gave her so much more personality and screen time. It made her feel that much more crucial, not even to the story, but in bringing out Cloud's hidden personality. When it came to her chirpy and cheeky character, it was something I never realized I wanted so badly until this remake. However, I had to save the best for last. There is a character, one singular character, I've yet to mention, and it's mostly due to the fact it's hard for me to explain how I really feel towards her, and that of course is Aerith. I would be lying to you if I said I was the biggest Aerith fan in the original game. Whilst yes, I did like her character overall, as far as the original goes, I was more of a Tifa fan. Now this might have something to do with me playing Crisis Core before the original FF7, leaving me with some mixed opinions about Cloud and Aerith, but that's a topic for another day. What this remake managed to do, I would have never predicted. It made me fall in love with a character that I originally had very mixed opinions on during the original game. I would honestly struggle to point out just one single reason for why this is the case. It could be because of her amazingly demonstrated personality, or maybe because she has what I consider a perfect introduction chapter. Then again, it could be the fact she holds so much mystery. Aerith comes off so pure-hearted, yet clearly troubled, making me want to protect her at every moment of the journey. At the same time, I also just want more of her in the next game because I believe she has the answers to my biggest questions regarding the story. I honestly can't tell you what it is, but I have to take a moment to appreciate the amazing job that Brianna White did as a voice actor. To be honest, I very rarely search up who the voice actor is for a video game character, but when I do, it's because I want to respect whoever it is for immersing me so much in whoever it might be at the time. I think at this stage of the video, there's been a bit too much praise without focusing on certain flaws the game comes with. Whilst none of what I'm about to say really takes away from my overall opinion of the remake being one of the best Final Fantasy experiences I've had, I also can't move on without discussing my biggest issue during not only my recent playthrough, but also my initial one when the game first launched. This remake has a major issue, one that stands out above the rest, that being its pacing. As mentioned previously, the entirety of the game is split into chapters, 18 of them to be exact. They all cover different areas and events taking place during the game, and will usually focus on one specific task or character. For the most part, these chapters come together well, connecting the end of one nicely with the start of the next. However, it's what makes up these chapters that can really throw off the smooth playthrough. The idea of extending what was originally a 6-hour segment into 30 plus hours was guaranteed to come with difficulties, and unfortunately some of these are way too obvious for the player to ignore. I mentioned earlier how there's a lot of mechanics that are simply there to slow you down, and even though I understand that's necessary to allow the game to load, here's my biggest issue with it. A lot of these moments simply did not need to be there. It's fine once in a while, and especially when it looks believable. However, when standing next to a 3-foot drop, it's a nuisance and annoyance to the player that you can't just drop down but instead have to find a ladder for a cinematic walk down. That's not to say old chapters struggle from this issue. In fact, for the majority of my playthrough, I was able to look over these moments due to them being spread out in a not so obvious way. However, unfortunately, when it's bad, it is very apparent. When looking at individual chapters, one comes to mind straight away, that being chapter 11, aka the train graveyard. This chapter is slow. There is no other way to put it. And even though some might find the plot sections of it to be interesting, what doesn't help is the fact that it takes place right around when the player is about to drop on Sector 7. At the beginning of this exact chapter, you are supposedly rushing to reach the Sector 7 slums, having heard that Shinra is planning to drop the plate. This builds up tension and anxiety regarding if we will make it in time. You, the player, are excited and nervous at the same time. On one hand, here you are trying to rush, whilst on the other, you're in the middle of arguably the most tedious section of the game. Other chapters such as 17 or 6 both struggle heavily from constant back and forth between sections, flipping switches, fighting enemies, flipping more switches, and so on. Meanwhile, the first half of chapter 9 has you redoing the exact same minigame 3 times. But in fairness, as much as I hate this section, I have to admit that little interaction between Aerith and Cloud at the end kinda nearly makes up for all of it. Chapter 9 is overall considered one of the best in the entire game, and I agree. I mean, I don't have to say anything about it, just simply look at the screen. This is peak Final Fantasy right here, but it feels weird how to get to this crazy bizarre section of the game, you first have to do this. These are just some examples where I simply wish the game would just let you carry on to the next segment rather than feeling delayed by 30 minutes for arguably no reason. And what makes this issue stand out more are the chapters which handle the slow pacing much more naturally, with chapter 8 being the perfect example. I had zero issues with the slow rooftop section of chapter 8. In fact, I wanted more of it. It took its time to introduce the character through gameplay discussions rather than a long cutscene. These conversations alongside a beautiful track to accompany you distract away from what otherwise is the most basic and slow gameplay, and it just showcases Square Enix is capable of doing this right. They just can't stay consistent. If my opinion is actually something you consider worth caring about, then I say it is undeniable that the remake is a great game overall. Even with a far from perfect pacing, I don't want this to make the remake sound worse than it actually is, because the game offers so many great moments that I think should be appreciated much more. When looking at it from a critical standpoint, it has incredible visuals both in and outside of its gameplay, smooth combat that most action fans should find enjoyment in, managing to mix in smaller sections of strategy to control the pace of fights, a strong foundation of characters and world, as well as many mysteries surrounding what is to come in future parts. That last bit there is extremely crucial considering this game is based on an already established title, a phenomenal soundtrack which refreshes many old tracks, allowing them to feel very modern whilst also remaining full of nostalgia. That's on top of also managing to bring in new tracks which felt like they were there from day one. Hollow being a personal standout that may be one of my favourite individual gaming tracks I have ever heard. It's one of the reasons Sector 5 Slums is my favourite area in the game. This remake truly managed to capture me and have me wanting to play more every single day. It really is one of those games you think about from the moment you put the controller down to when you play it again. And this is a combination of being able to replicate and recreate magic of the original game, but also smoothly fitting in old and new sections and characters. From Madam M to Chocobo Sam, Andrea, Leslie, Roach, and you know what? I'm gonna say it. Even goddamn Chudley. All of these characters work. Not only do they work, they also feel like they were always there. Me personally, during the original game in Midgar, I only really cared about the main playable crew, but with this remake I was able to engage with so many more characters that I would love to see in the future parts. During the game there are also 3 chapters which are filled with side quests, that being chapter 3, 9 and 14. Whilst it is a bit of an odd choice to only let you do side quests during these specific chapters, it does actually make sense considering how linear the main plot is. Once you leave an area you won't be coming back for a while, and when you do it might not exactly be the same place as it was before. Admittedly, this can make some side quests feel a bit more like chores by the end, since the game double checks if you're certain you don't want to do anything else before moving on, but with the exception of chapter 14, these usually aren't too long and can be completed within a couple hours, serving as a good time or even just simply gaining XP outside of the regular grinding you would find yourself doing within these games. There's even activities to do outside of the side quests themselves, with the star of the show easily being the Underground Coliseum. I love this section of the game. It just makes sense that a wall market would have something as crazy and bizarre as this under the city. It's a good area to gain XP, level up materia, weapons, but also win some solid rewards that will help in the late game. Also, I hope I'm not the only one who keeps thinking about this, but if Square Enix managed to do this, then why couldn't we have it in Kingdom Hearts 3? Anyone else really bummed out about that? Overall, the remake offers so much greatness, it manages to have you overlooking a lot of its smaller issues. Whilst it is far from perfect, and it is still struggling from the modern Square Enix side quest issue, meaning nothing too impactful actually happens, I do believe there's something here for most to get distracted and sucked in rather than just playing the game purely for the main story. That said, once we do just focus on the main story, things get a bit controversial. It is from this point forward that this video will contain spoilers for both the remake and the original game, so please do keep in mind before continuing you are okay with that. As you're playing through the experience that is this remake, depending on how much of a fan of the original game you are, you might notice certain things just don't exactly seem the same. Some smaller details that can be easily brushed off, whilst others not so much. Now that we've had some more time to think over everything, it's much easier to understand what Square Enix did here. Rather than remaking a fan-loved story, they instead decided to create a brand new path within the universe of Final Fantasy VII. If you're unaware, this version of Final Fantasy VII does not follow the original step for step in certain areas. In fact, it changes a lot of story plot points, events and outcomes which all relate to the same new addition, the Whispers, also known as the Arbiters of Fate. These are here for one singular task, to make sure everything that happens in the game is the same way as the original Final Fantasy VII. It starts off simple and not really noticeable at first, with things such as Jessie injuring her ankle before the second mission, meaning she has to stay behind. Or another time when Cloud is fighting Reno as he defeats him and is about to land the killing blow, the Whispers interfere. During these moments, it can be easy to not realize what is happening. However, when you reach the final chapters, things take a turn with much more obvious ones, such as Barrett being healed after suffering a blow from Sephiroth. Then we have Wedge being pushed out of the Shinra building, causing him to most likely die, even though he should have never survived falling out of the Sector 7 plate. Or even Hojo revealing Cloud's real identity, which would completely change his character at this point in the game. But in case you still didn't realize it, then there's Red 13, who comes in and basically straight up tells you these Whispers are trying to keep everything the way it was in the original timeline. This was definitely the biggest risk Square Enix made when it comes to this remake, because as the game reaches the final moments, it is clear that we the player have managed to defeat the Arbiters of Fate and are now on our way to a new unknown future. Cloud and the others are shown major events that take place in the quote-unquote original timeline, almost as a way to tell them this is what you're fighting against. If you manage to win right here and now, you can change these moments. Unlike many fans of the original Final Fantasy VII, I don't actually hate this whole idea being introduced here, and my reasoning might seem a bit odd to many people, but I like not knowing what to expect. I think one of the main reasons I was able to enjoy the remake and its story as much as I did is because despite liking the original, I'm okay with a new version of Final Fantasy VII. If I wanted to revisit the original story, I can always do that by simply replaying it. Now, that said, I am also fully aware it's because I'm not a die-hard fan. If Square Enix for whatever reason decided to do this with Final Fantasy X, which is my personal favourite, I am certain I would have many issues with this concept. If I was told I'm getting a quote-unquote remake of my favourite Final Fantasy, I would expect to replay my favourite game with the most modern technology available. So yes, I do understand the frustration of so many original fans. However, as far as I see it, for me personally, personally, some of these changes made the game so much better. Taking Chapter 4 for example, the entire segment of visiting Jessie's house and learning about her past did so much more for her character development than the original ever did. This led to a far more impactful Chapter 12 death, which actually had me emotional, unlike the original game where I kinda just brushed it off. And the same can be said for Biggs and Wedge, who, funnily enough, are both part of Chapter 4. Also, I don't really have anywhere else to put this, but the scene of Cloud saying "you owe me a pizza" is literally the new gen version of "who will I have ice cream with?" Now, a change that I do feel a bit mixed about is regarding two extremely critical characters for the story that's to come, that being Aerith and Sephiroth. These two play massive roles in the original game. Both of their actions as well as events happening between them lead to defining moments for the rest of the group, but especially Cloud. The remake decided to provide both of these characters with much more screen time, yet surround them with much more mystery at the same time, mostly due to them acting outside of the story we are familiar with. Sephiroth is no longer just an image that we chase after and have to learn about through flashbacks. Just in part 1 alone, we get to interact with him on so many more occasions, even if it is just Sephiroth clones. His character showing up in front of Cloud through visions and causes of migraines differs heavily from the original story. Whilst I don't think this ruins his character at all, I do have to admit in the remake whenever Sephiroth shows up, it isn't as much of a shock factor as the original. Wherever they decide to take his story, it is clear in this remake Sephiroth has much more power and knowledge than in the original. However, every time we got to witness him in the original game, it felt like a shock and reward that would suddenly shift the tone of whatever came before it. Whereas in the remake, even if he did give off a similar presence, where this could be an issue is in the future parts. Considering we already faced a version of him at the finale of this game, will him showing up in Cloud's head still be as impactful considering the player knows they defeated him at least once? Let's say the final section of the plot remains similar enough to the original game and he is the main villain at the end. It will feel like round 2 of the finale of this game rather than the whole story's worth of build up. I'm not saying he shouldn't have been the final boss in part 1 because I love this end fight. My only worry is that Square Enix will feel the pressure of having each part needing to outdo the previous final boss, which could lead to a burnout by the final game. Worst thing I can imagine them doing is having Sephiroth always be the final battle. Just imagine 3 or 4 games where going into it you know who the final boss will be, taking away the intrigue factor and instead replacing it with thoughts of, so when does Sephiroth show up? Plus the fact you've already seen a lot of his main movesets in the previous games. I'm not saying all of this because I'm tired of Sephiroth or I don't want to see him in future games. I'm saying all of this because the more they decide to show, the harder it will be to recreate that original feeling Sephiroth managed to create in every scene he was in. Now as for Aerith, I previously mentioned how much I love her character in the remake, and of course I do stand by that statement. Everything about the way she's portrayed made me love any scene she was involved in. However, what I do feel a bit mixed on is her role in the remake. Aerith was a crucial character in the original game, just like Sephiroth, but in this remake she is so much more than we anticipated. To keep it brief, Aerith supposedly knows everything as far as the original timeline goes, from the events that will take place now all the way up until the end of the original game, that of course including her death. Due to this, she gives a lot of cryptic and yet meaningful dialogues throughout the story. Most of these are very generic and unnoticeable to the player on the first playthrough. However, the second time round, suddenly every sentence she says carries more weight to it than one would initially assume. A good example of this would be when the Sector 7 player is under attack. Tifa says we need to make it in time to save it from the bombing. In response to this, Aerith gives an uncomfortable look before replying with a simple, "Sure." There isn't any faith or determination in this answer, almost as to imply she knows this plate will fall and preventing it would be greatly difficult. However, outside of this, she also does provide scenes which imply her real objective of changing certain things to come, with quotes like, "The future isn't set in stone." A character who knows what is to come would only say something like this if she was planning to change the currently set future events. My issue with all of this regarding Aerith isn't so much that she knows all of it, but rather the amount of mystery she holds. Just how much does she know? Why won't she open up about more of this knowledge, and how long has she been aware of all of this? I didn't like the fact that Red 13 provides us with more answers in the same chapter we meet him than Aerith does in the entire game, especially considering he learns all of this thanks to Aerith sharing her knowledge in the first place. So do I fully hate the changes to the story? No. But it frustrates me realizing she holds even more secrets and mystery than in the original, and we the players don't really have a full understanding of her final goal. So before we reach the final segment of this video, there's just one more new addition to look at in a bit more detail and actually appreciate everything it brings to the table. Because not only does it expand what is already a great experience, but it does it through the eyes of the ever so chirpy, loud and in-your-face energetic Great Ninja Yuffie. Unlike the rest of the game, this was my very first time playing the Yuffie DLC, so if you're still one of the lost souls searching for a PS5, just know my thoughts are with you. Square Enix doesn't exactly have an amazing record when it comes to DLCs. Often they lead to be pretty disappointing and most of them get spoiled through trailers. Once again, I'm looking at you, Kingdom Hearts 3. So with that said, I am extremely happy to say the Yuffie DLC was some of the most fun additional content I got to play in recent years. It is kept short, to the point, provides new gameplay sections both in and outside of combat, as well as genuinely intriguing story which smoothly fits into the main game. Not once did I feel like Yuffie's story felt forced, but now that I played it, I can't imagine the remake without it. The entirety of this DLC takes place between chapters 8 and 12 of the main game. Yuffie, who is a Wutai ninja, is tasked with obtaining the most powerful materia from the Shinra headquarters. She is to do this with the help of a brand new character, Sonon, who is a fellow Wutai ninja soldier. The two of them receive assistance from Avalanche HQ, which is not the same Avalanche we're familiar with. In fact, they refer to that group as the Splinter Cell and aren't exactly happy with their recent actions. In terms of gameplay, Yuffie plays the same as what we've been accustomed to by this point. The same methods of combat and leveling up are used throughout. It is encouraging to see this rather than something similar to Final Fantasy XV's DLC where there was a slight revamp to the combat system. It will allow the transition of Yuffie into future parts feel more like a reunion rather than learning something new from scratch. Outside of the combat, gameplay is once again very similar in almost every aspect, with the only differences being the ability to run across wall sections, plus the ability to throw Yuffie's shuriken to unlock certain pathways or break some boxes. Although for what it's worth, the big issue I had in the main game regarding slow, tedious crossing sections is nearly fully gone in this DLC. It will be interesting to see if this was due to Yuffie being more agile compared to Cloud, or is this because of PS5 allowing the game developers to remove a lot of these sections. That would actually be a pretty good explanation for the PS5 exclusivity. However, what is the real star of the show in this DLC for me personally is the new minigame introduced called Fort Condor. I'm willing to say about 40% of my playtime in this DLC was just this minigame alone. It is so simple yet such an enjoyable time kill. I love the idea of wanting to beat everyone I could, especially seeing as they were all characters from the main story. Even our boy Roach made it. What this DLC managed to do unintentionally, however, is highlight some of the biggest flaws of the combat system, that being repetitiveness and potential boredom. Whilst I do find a lot of enjoyment in the combat overall, what makes it constantly fun and fluid in my eyes is the ability to switch between characters non-stop, meaning depending on the enemy I would alternate characters depending on who fits the situation best, but I also wouldn't get tired of seeing the same attack animations for too long. In the case of this DLC, you will only control Yuffie for the entire duration, so when you're facing fights every few seconds, it can get a bit tedious and boring just constantly doing the same attacks over and over again, especially when it's the same enemies one after another. As for the story, although the first half isn't anything special, I do want to give props to the second half and some really good execution of Sonon's character. Admittedly, at the start I didn't really care for his backstory, I found it to be pretty typical and generic. However, by the end of the second half, this DLC managed to do something even the main game couldn't. They executed Sonon's death scene in a way that felt by far the most impactful up to this point. From the setup to the perfectly placed flashback, the music that manages to pull on your emotions, and a dying scene that uses what seemed like a tiny silly detail to showcase the character being beyond saving. So whilst the DLC was very simple, it still set up Yuffie ready to go for part 2, some new potential villains, and even more possible questions for the future games. And with that, there is just one more thing to touch on. What exactly can we expect? We are left with so many uncertainties about what could happen next. Why can Rufus see the whispers? What does that mean for the future of Shinra, and what could they be planning? How is it possible Zack not only survived but is heading into Midgar with a version of Cloud from his timeline? Are we going to be playing through two different timelines at once, or is this somehow happening in the same one? Also, this is more of a prayer than anything, but can we please get a new voice actor for Zack? This man is killing my favourite Final Fantasy character before my eyes. I deadass have to watch this scene with the volume turned down. Why out of all the characters did they manage to mess up this one the most? It was so heartbreaking. Just, how did you go from this?
The price of freedom is steep.
To this.
The price of freedom is steep.
Please, can we just start a petition? I'll even make like fake accounts. We discover a whole underground Shinra lab below Sector 7 with unrecognizable creatures. Just what is all of that about? Will that blow out of proportion months down the line from when we leave? There's also a ton of character related questions such as Leslie and his fiance. Will we get to see a potential reunion there? Maybe she's waiting for him somewhere else, like, I don't know, the Golden Saucer. And speaking of the Golden Saucer, it's a high possibility we might get to see Jessie there. right? Not only is it potentially implied she survived at the very end of the game with her glove and headbands by Biggs in the orphanage, but also if we left Midgar and we are now in a completely different timeline, maybe she's alive and still works there like she mentioned during chapter 4. And what about Marlene? It's clear Aerith showed her something during chapter 12 to gain her trust, but just what exactly was it? There are so many more small and big unanswered questions that we simply have to wait to see the answers to in the future parts. But if there was to be a main question I personally have, it would have to be, what exactly is Aerith planning? At this point, with the amount of details she's hiding from us, can we really be sure she's not going to use us for her own advantage? The Aerith we know would never do that, of course. She's a loving and caring girl. But is it really the same Aerith that we know? Questions like this is what makes me beyond excited for the future of the remake, and I can't wait to have even more questions and answers after part 2 comes out. The Final Fantasy VII Remake might not have turned out to be what many were hoping for. Rather than embracing the role of a reimagination that stuck true to everything the original game did, it turned out to be a new tale that could be argued to be more of a sequel to Final Fantasy VII than a remake. So yes, a lot of the fan disappointments that came from this game is fair and justified due to false hopes set out by Square Enix. However, I don't look at the remake as the new Final Fantasy VII, I look at it as a new tale, a new chapter. The real, true FF7 will always be available to us in all its glory if we wish to go back and re-experience it. But this game right here is something new. Whether you can enjoy that or not is up to you, but it doesn't change the clear facts about this game. The remake is a great game, one of the best single player Square Enix experiences we've had in recent years. Regardless if that's due to the source material or not, this game offers constant reasons to be embraced as a great Final Fantasy experience. From its truly stunning visuals to an emotional and breathtaking soundtrack, from thrilling boss battles to shocking story reveals, from beautifully presented characters to bonds that are built and will keep holding on until its sequels are released. The remake was a game that I loved every single moment of. It's immersive and can draw a player in to be truly lost in the city of Midgar. Whether that's exploring the slums, helping citizens, challenging others to squats and pull-ups, aiming to get the best score at darts, or even looking stunning and confident when the lights shine the brightest. It is a game powerful enough to even make the player want to re-experience the original game once again. Not just to compare, but to get more of this universe for a different method. Regardless if this is your first or 10th Final Fantasy game, in my eyes this is a title everyone should experience at some point or another. It is a showcase of what this company can do when it uses its best resources and gives something enough time to come out the way it was envisioned. Because even if the direction of this game isn't ideal for you, at no point did we hear there was content missing or something wasn't how it's meant to be, which should give us, the fans, hope for future projects this company might be working on, and that Square Enix finally understands when not to waste a golden opportunity. And just like that, another long critique video in the books that has been in the works for months. As always, if you're still here, you are a real one. I am losing my goddamn voice. Oh wow. I really appreciate you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, then the biggest thing you could do is a simple like and a comment if you really want to help. I'm able to create a new video about every 2 months or so each one of your likes and comments is crucial to help me grow this channel. Let me know what you thought of the video as always, even if you hated it or you disagreed, then go ahead, say that. I am all for it. This is all just my opinion, meaning I am in no way more correct than whatever you might think. If you are interested in what long project is in the work next, it will be the Final Fantasy VI video, then potentially after, I will continue the Kingdom Hearts series critique. I think I'm ready to jump back into it, and I've been really craving some Kingdom Hearts 2 action, but just don't quote me on that because you know how things work, it might get delayed or something like that. I'm interested to see if you guys have any games coming this year that you would want to see a video about. It doesn't have to be a JRPG either, as I do play all sorts of game. I mean, right now, I wish I was playing Elden Ring, knowing that I'm going to have to edit this for about 30 to 50 hours, but I mean, I do it because I love it, so I appreciate, you guys checking this out. Make sure to check out any other videos that might be up your alley, maybe the Final Fantasy Worth Playing series, or even the Kingdom Hearts videos. Those are the more recent critiques, which I am so proud of, and you guys seem to really have enjoyed them, so I hopefully, if you haven't, go check those out, they're really good. I won't keep you here much longer, so with that said, thank you so much for checking out this video. I really hugely appreciate you, and hopefully we'll see you around in future videos. It's been me, Prez. Thank you for watching, have a great day, and I'm out.